So I will list these as separate podcasts and not, whatever. You can look them up. So I will title them accordingly. This one is called Early Warning Systems for Food Crisis Risks. I shouldn't call it food security risk, food crisis risk, which is slightly different. So that's chapter 2. Key messages here: early warning, early action systems provide alerts of potential food crises identified as sudden and substantial increases in acute food insecurity, as well as guidance to policymakers and international development agencies about needs for humanitarian action. So here we are with the definition for food crisis: sudden and substantial increases in acute food insecurity. Use of different methodologies and varying coverage of vulnerable populations mean different early warning systems for acute food insecurity can yield dissimilar estimates of the severity of food crises. So it's very region specific as always. Local food security monitoring systems are poorly connected to systems that track global food and agricultural market trends. Monitoring of acute food insecurity and chronic food insecurity are poorly integrated at the country level itself. This leads to differing interpretations of the nature and magnitude of food crises. Existing systems pay insufficient attention to structural vulnerabilities that determine how different shocks, including global price shocks, affect food insecurity in particular contexts and compound others of acute compound other causes of acute food insecurity such as poverty, conflict, and climate change. So there's a cascading effect. Famines are acquisition was the word I was looking for in the last podcast, sorry. Governments have grain acquisition systems where they buy from farmers and then they distribute. Famines are the catastrophic expression of severe food crises. Today's famine-like contexts are mostly driven by conflict. So it's not necessarily that there is a food insecurity, but there are conflicts which affect people's access, quality, and quantity of food. It can be physical limitation or economic limitation in terms of quantity or access. Conflict typically impedes the data collection required by existing protocols for declaring famine, which can delay humanitarian action at the expense of a preventable human toll. And this often is also related to conflicts because one group may be trying to prevent the other group from having access and creating, even banning humanitarian action. To increase the effectiveness of early warning systems, it's important to expand the country's coverage and frequency of consensus-based acute food insecurity analysis, revise the protocol for declaration of a famine to ensure it's operational in conflict-affected locations, better integrate the various types of early warning systems for food crises through much stronger collaborative efforts across responsible international organizations with support from the research community and in consultation with policymakers, development agencies, and local actors. Improve monitoring of risk factors and structural causes of crises to support the development of real-time early warning systems that are able to anticipate and potentially help prevent food crises through timely and well-targeted responses. Strengthen analysis of factors driving crises in particular places, including global supply and price shocks, how these are transmitted to local contexts, and what structural vulnerabilities increase or mitigate their impact, and how they affect acute and chronic food insecurity. This informs long-term responses that build resilience and reduce the risks of food crises. So this is what early warnings of food crisis risk are all about. Again, to look at some data, chronic hunger and acute food insecurity going from 2000 to 2021. So millions people suffering hunger, prevalence of undernourishment, so POU is the acronym all in percentages, so you have POUs here and actual number of people here. So the prevalence and the actual numbers in percentages, so you can match the percentage. What is a high percentage for prevalence of undernourishment? Even 1% is high, right? But it needs to be as low as possible. So when you cross certain percentage and the numbers are, you know, close to 1 billion here, that's not good. Again, the bad news is that we were dropping and maybe have flattened out, would have flattened out at 500 million and make slow progress towards decreasing further, but the pandemic came and jumped the numbers again in terms of chronic hunger. This is not good. It's not just undernourishment, it's chronic hunger. People facing crisis level or worse acute food insecurity from 2016 to 22 has grown up in number of millions. So again, this is projected for 2022 when this report was published, but you can see that there was maybe a little downward trend, but immediately picked up again with COVID and is expected to grow. So I have to check the latest numbers, but the report which was just published doesn't have the data either. Defining food insecurity more carefully here. Food insecurity is broadly defined as the lack of secure access to insufficient, safe and nutritious food needed for normal human growth and development and for an active and healthy life. It's not just about surviving, but to actually have an active and healthy life. Chronic food insecurity describes a situation where people are unable to meet their minimum food requirements, usually defined as minimum intake of calories. So usually where the calories come from matter as well, and there are also ideas about the quality of food, because junk food is not a good quality food and it has all sorts of negative consequences. So describes a situation where people are unable to meet their minimum food requirements over a sustained period of time, usually over the course of a year or longer. Chronic food deprivation is most closely associated with hunger, that is, the prevalence of undernourishment as monitored by the Food and Agricultural Organization FAO of the United Nations and other international organizations. Acute food insecurity is defined as any manifestation of food insecurity at a specific point in time of a severity that threatens lives, livelihoods, or both, regardless of the causes, context, and duration. Remember, here we are not talking about climate change explicitly, which is the main topic of adaptation, but climate change is always the big umbrella under which many of these things are happening in terms of food losses, agricultural impacts, conflicts, displacements, etc. Acute food insecurity is highly susceptible to change and can manifest in a population within a short amount of time as a result of sudden changes or shocks that affect determinants of food insecurity and malnutrition. Acute food insecurity can be transitory in the sense that it reflects a short-term or temporary inability to meet food consumption requirements related to sporadic crises, which suggest a capacity to recover. Okay, that's important. However, situations of severe acute food insecurity often emerge in contexts where widespread chronic food insecurity already exists and where affected people have little to no capacity to recover without assistance. That's always critical. Looking at share of analyzed populations in crisis level or worse acute food insecurity in 45 countries and territories in 2022. So you have a scale here, percentage of analyzed populations, so in ranges, in crisis or worse. So this is from the Institute for Purchase. You have to look it up. This is a French word and this is an English word. That is some policy institute or equivalent. So they do this analysis. Sorry, I'm not always. So this is food security. This is global organization against food insecurity, and so there are many acronyms which unfortunately I cannot keep in my head, but you can look them up. They are the ones producing these data, so we are mostly interested in the data. So let's look at these. The faded orangish color is less than 5%. The dark reddish color here is 25 to 50%, and there are no 2022 data in these gray colors. country not selected for analysis are in these lighter gray. So Nepal and Sri Lanka show up in this analysis as having no 2022 data, and so does Mongolia and other Western Eurasian countries, Afghanistan, many African countries. I think this is Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Zambia, Zimbabwe. So there are many countries which are, 10 to 25% or 25 to 50% or greater than 50% even in terms of percentage of the analyzed population in crisis or worse or equivalent. Okay, so this is not a good situation, obviously, and you can look at Central America here more for El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and so on. Haiti is, of course, always a hotspot for a child poster in many ways for these kinds of crises. So agricultural, market and food insecurity early warning systems by type and frequency of information. So this is, I should actually make sure I at least mention, this is the Global Earth Observation monitoring of agricultural insecurity. So Crop Watch there, that's Food Security Portal 1 and 2. This is the FAS, yes, FAO STAT is the Food and Agricultural Organization's STAT. FuseNet is Food Energy Water Security Network, and so on. So this is the one we mentioned before, but basically looking again on the data, not worrying too much about the agencies that are doing it. Here we have a mixture of agricultural and food security issues in terms of information, and here we have frequency of information being very infrequent to monthly to being real time, so you can get yesterday's data today. Agricultural information systems are bunched in here, mixed in terms of agriculture and food security here. So food security is a processed information from agriculture, obviously. Food security information and early warning systems. So it's good that some of them have food security and early warnings in near real time up here, for example, and some are down here at monthly scale and some are very infrequent. It often depends on whether the system is set up to collect data and whether the data that is collected is shared or if there is no system to share at all, and so on and so forth. The integrated food security phase classification, that's the IPCC purchase something here. Integrated phase classification, consensus-based identification of food crisis. IPCC sets a common standard and shared language for classifying severity of acute food crisis situations using a 5-phase scale, and provides information on the number of people affected and on the drivers of food insecurity. Okay, so here we are with Cater Harmonise is CH, and IPCC is combined with them in this report. So these are the IPCC-CH acute food insecurity phase description and priority response objectives. I won't read all of them. So phase 1, none or minimal in terms of food security, stressed, crisis, emergency, catastrophe, and famine. Similar to like a cyclone or a hurricane scale, just to give you a sense. There are phase description and priority responses associated with them. We can just look at actions recommended, action required to build resilience, and for disaster risk reduction. So this is more of a planning, early warning for anticipating risks here. Here, action required for disaster risk reduction and to protect livelihoods, so you have additional impacts expected. Urgent action required to protect livelihoods and reduce food consumption gaps, so you're already beginning to have impacts on nourishment. Urgent action required to save lives and livelihoods, and here urgent action required to revert or prevent widespread death and total collapse of livelihoods. So that's a very severe situation. In terms of conclusion for this chapter, there is simply not enough funding available to address the increasing number of crises and beneficiaries already in need, and the deepening climate crisis will widen this funding gap. So we are now looking at climate adding on top this funding to the funding crisis, as well as the food insecurity itself and conflicts, etc. If interventions instead remain focused on emergency relief, the world will have to provide more and more assistance with every lean season. So instead of building resilience for the future, if we are already always dealing with disasters that are ongoing, then obviously we will never get out of the cycle. Better early warning systems for anticipating would allow governments early warning, early anticipation systems would allow governments and international agencies to tackle food crises earlier and more effectively, and to reorient interventions toward resilience building. This is critical. We must build resilient systems for the future and not get stuck in managing crises. More work is needed to integrate, or at least to better explain, the different approaches and methodologies currently used by these EWEAs to identify acute food insecurity, monitor chronic food insecurity, and incorporate the key information provided by agricultural market warning systems. More intensive cooperation between existing platforms such as AMIS and on the one hand, and FSIN and GNAFC on the other will be needed to move forward. Let me just add the acronyms here by pausing for a minute. So sorry about that. Let's move forward with these. Yeah, so sorry here. So agricultural market and food insecurity early warning systems by type and frequency of information that we looked at already. This is food security portal 1 and 2. This is the I keep forgetting. This is the agricultural market information system. This is the foreign agricultural services, and this is the global information and early warning systems. This is the vulnerability analysis and mapping. This is the integrated purchase collection, integrated agricultural purchase collection. This is the French word. This is the famine early warning system network that I probably misstated before. This is of course the FAO's STAT program. They are the ones here. Integrated food security and phase collection, we already talked about the various things, and I hope I remember where I left. Yeah, I left it off here. So we were talking about more intensive cooperation between existing platforms such as agricultural market information system on the one hand, and food security information network and global network against food crisis on the other will be needed to move forward. The importance of adequate agricultural market information and food security monitoring mechanisms has been repeatedly reiterated by multiple global platforms and gained prominence with the 2022 global food crisis as reflected in the 2022 G20 Leaders Declaration and the initiative of the G7 development ministers for a global alliance for food security. That's very critical to have coordinated efforts, but this internationally concerted support is essential, but will be most effective if it drives the improvement and integration of existing mechanisms rather than creating new ones. Okay? To effectively and efficiently support responses to food crises, early warning systems must be enhanced to include real-time monitoring of key risk factors and vulnerabilities that affect food access in rapidly changing global and national contexts, along with analysis of how those risk factors and vulnerabilities increase the likelihood of food crisis situations. Most importantly, they must inform policy recommendations for buffering the most harmful impact of those shocks in the short run, and for building sustainable resilience for the long term. The chapters that follow explore both the types of early action that early warning systems can facilitate and short and long-term policy responses that can reduce the frequency and impact of food crises. This is very critical. Instead of being stuck in crisis management, we have to have room to make policies and implement them to build resilience for the future. Risk will never be zero, as we have said many times, which means food crisis may come along, but the impacts have to be minimized. So I leave this podcast here, and we'll come back and read off these descriptions of some early warning and other relevant monitoring systems, and then we'll look at some tools and models before we move to chapter 3. So the following 4 chapters will look at how early warnings can be aimed and should help with managing the crisis and building resilience and reducing the impact of crisis if and when they do occur. Okay.